into a world-class city, you have these non-functional features of it, and you have an interesting intellectual environment at the same time. So I guess she will be talking to you about some of these things, the intellectual part. Now, it's very difficult to introduce someone like Professor Patel, so I'm not really going to do that, except to say that I'm very happy personally to have her here today to initiate two things. One is our seminar series for these 2 semesters. And two, if you are trying to welcome a group of young scholars to the master's program or any other program, and you are going to do a lecture that deals with the discipline, then obviously she is one of the best people to do it. So for those 2 reasons, I'm very happy that she is here with us. For me at least, the best known text that she has written is this thing that I thought I was doing Sociology in India, which I am currently reading. And if you haven't read it, it's something we have ordered for the library. You should start reading because it will give you a sense of sociology in this particular locality. Now, to me, she is also important to this department because she is one of the people who was instrumental in having the first 5 teachers of this department in place. So if you have any complaints about Ravi Kumar, myself, Dev, Farid and Chudamani, later on you can complain to her as well. So thank you very much, Sujata.
Thank you, Sujata, for a warm and generous introduction. I'm a social theorist and also work on cities in South Asia. And one of the questions I had about cities in South Asia is what kind of paradigm do I use to understand cities and urbanization? And it is this question that led me about a decade or 2 back to try and understand the received legacy of sociological theorizing, which always talked about villages. And if it at all talked about anything other than villages, it talked about a point not distant, but a point which the entire country will realize, which is either called urbanism, or called modernity, or called, and therefore called it a new India, which can be realized as and when the village life gets destroyed. And of course, never ever analyze what that end would be, what it can be, or what it might not be. It is this set of issues that made me go back into the history of how social science, and particularly sociology and anthropology, got institutionalized in India, and to try and understand through a sociology of knowledge perspective the ways in which certain things were made absent and certain other things were made visible in the organization of the discipline in India. Now, that is what the book is about. And that is a lot of my work has to do with that question. But today, I'm not going to talk only about India, but I'm going to talk about South Asia. And the title that I am given for the discussion today, and if you feel that what I'm saying is unclear, you can stop me in between also. The title that I'm given today relates to a question that I've been bothered about for some time. And that is social science beyond binaries, a sociology for South Asia. I put a question mark, but that question mark got deleted in the announcement that was made. And I would like you to, that's why I'm announcing the title again, because I would like to talk about the question mark. And in order to talk about the question mark, I want to explicate first what I mean by South Asia. And then I want to go ahead by discussing what is binaries and why I say we have to discuss social science and not sociology or anthropology. So let me start with South Asia. One of the very peculiar things about SARC, which says it is discussing South Asia, and this is a SARC university, is that it brings in Maldives but doesn't bring in Myanmar. Or it brings in Afghanistan. And if we go on asking these questions, who is brought in and who is not brought in, it is important to recognize that we are not talking of a geography. We are not talking of a boundary called South Asia. Rather, we are talking of a political, historical entity which was constructed by British India. Actually, SARC is what British India, its heritage and legacy lies in British India. And I want to bring that in because ultimately it's about colonialism. What colonial authorities suggested was a region is what we today define as a region of nation states. And I want to bring this aspect in for the discussion because the other two things that I'm going to talk about, social science and binaries, is also about colonialism. So colonialism organized a particular way in which capitalism entered into this entire region from the 19th century onwards. So in some cases earlier also, in some cases later also. And together with that colonialism, once that colonialism transcended into a colonial system of political authority, from mid-19th century onwards in India, but then later in other parts of the region, it constructed national entities. And with these national entities, it also, and with its boundaries, it also constructed the discourses, the knowledge about who and what and how the people there live. So, to understand what sociology and anthropology is, it's important to understand what colonialism is and what is colonialism's strategies of rule that allowed for the construction of this discourses of knowledge that became ultimately the mirror image for which we all understood ourselves. Separately as nation states, but also within nation states as groups of ethnic, caste, religious groups, which continue to define our identity today. Some nation states define their identity in terms of religion, but some nation states don't define their identity in terms of religion, but use religion to intervene in the politics of what constitutes the way in which social change and development takes place. So I think the legacy has to be, and the heritage has to be unraveled from 18th, 19th century onwards, both in terms of how colonialism structured a way of implementing uneven capitalist development, and I would emphasize uneven capitalist development. And secondly, how at a later stage it constructed knowledge for understanding the peoples who live in this region, which it later divided into nations, states. And these states were then identified with these people. Levi-Strauss, as you know, talked about colonialism as a handmaid, anthropology as a handmaid of colonialism. And one of the first and major disciplines that organized this intervention was anthropology. I'm sure that in the course of this semester and the coming semesters, you will be engaged with studying the work done by anthropologists who have shown how their own knowledge was used to dominate and categorize and classify the peoples of this region called South Asia. So I won't go into this in detail, except to mention three important points. That this was not a project only for South Asia. This was a project that took place across the world. 3/4 of the world was colonized up to 1945. And this project was also partly implemented in Africa. This project was implemented in a different way and much earlier, from 16th century, in Latin America. And it is important that we recognize that this was a project which went hand in glove with the economic project. Secondly, much of the interesting theoretical work on this project from the 16th century, especially in Latin America, has been done by the new dependency theorists, if you want to call them, using structuralism as a method to understand how in Latin America and this project got implemented. And in doing so, they have drawn attention to the major questions that sociology raised for itself in the 18th and 19th century in Europe. And this was the following. Europe saw itself as understanding itself as a modern society. And an understanding of itself as a modern society was located in terms of its history with the Greeks and the Romans. And therefore, when we study sociology, the enlightenment, the light that emerges of science and reason, enlightenment sees a genealogy in Greece and Rome, and the philosophical advances that organize this lineage into 18th century, the philosophies who put together the encyclopedia, in the 18th century. And the Latin American neo-dependency theorists, while looking at this 18th century, from 16th to 18th century phenomena of European Enlightenment, suggest that that they did so. That is, the European theorists understood their own origin by negating an origin which came from the Mediterranean region outside Greece. They call this a Eurocentric approach because this approach tried to put the space of Europe into its own history. That is the history which began with the Greece and Rome, and that continued till the present, to the time when we had modernity, which represented itself as the triumph of science and reason. And I don't know if this is true over here, but almost all sociological courses, when they are teaching theory, start with the Enlightenment, go to the classical thinkers, and then to the modern sociological theory, and then to contemporary sociological theory, see it as a linear development which didn't have any impact from anything outside Europe. And today, with this 18th century project of modernity, which self-identified itself as a project that comes out from Greek and Rome, was actually a reified theory. Reification is making something into a thing. A reified theory which negated the origin of Europe and its science, technology, as well as its philosophy outside Europe. And in 1980s, maybe 1989, the Marxist social scientist Samir Amin wrote a very interesting book on Eurocentrism, which actually locates the growth of modernity both in terms of its philosophy of science and reason, but also its reflexive ability in the work done of the Mediterranean region of Islam. In fact, with another work which has been done by the Cambridge historian called Black Athena, both these texts, and Black Athena is written by J.D. Berner's son, the historian of science, his son who was in Cambridge University. Black Athena. And I hope you understand what it means, that Athens, the fountainhead of knowledge, was actually not their knowledge, but it was on the African continent. Science, reason, philosophy, all had its germane location within the African continent. That was what Black Athena's 3 volumes tried to indicate through a long archival search. And it is this that I want to hark to suggest that in the structuring of sociology as a discipline of studying modern society, it tried to understand its lineage through its own Greek, Roman antecedents and heritage, while ignoring the heritage that came from outside Europe. Thereby, it tried to collapse time into space. And this collapse of time into space led to what Marx has always talked about in the volumes of Das Kapital, in which space loses out, geography loses out. And the geography ultimately, which has also lost out ultimately in the definition and citation. But to cut the story short, I've given you the 3 points, but to cut the story short, it is my argument, basing myself on the Latin American theories, that with the emergence of 18th century taught in the encyclopedic form. We saw, and this is what Latin American theorists talk about, we saw the growth of what has been called the binaries. Because Europe saw its own history in terms of its own space and not outside its space, the binary was geography. What was in the West was science, reason, and philosophy, modern Western philosophy. What was not in the West was all that was not in the West geographically. And that was in the East, which was spiritualism, religion, and traditions. And this binary became significant because, as you recall, Pierre Bourdieu, who also uses structuralism, talks about how classification systems, the master classification system gets associated with other minor classification systems in the way we structure the organizing the principles of social space. And this structuralism, this classification system of what is the West and what is the East led to, with Eurocentrism, a perception of what is called later Orientalism, which is what is the, or how is the Orient constructed. And with these two disciplines, with this Eurocentrism and Orientalism, the what is West and what is East are structured for two disciplines of sociology and anthropology. And both then use the theories and methodologies and methods organized by the discipline to understand the two worlds that they had to make its object of investigation. One, sociology studied modern society, and two, anthropology studied traditional society. The methods were different. One, the latter used ethnography and micro situations. The former used either historical, Wilber and Marx both were historical sociologists, or they used, as logical positivism developed in the Vienna Circle, they used the quantitative methods. And this dichotomy and division ultimately became gatekeepers of how to define oneself. I have quoted Professor Andraveti, and I realize you have also quoted Andraveti in a very interesting way when he suggests that in India, Professor Andraveti says, in India, I'm always considered a sociologist. But when I'm outside India, I'm always considered an anthropologist. One of the few sociologists, anthropologists who try to get into jobs in the United States or Europe find that they don't get jobs as sociologists. They get jobs as anthropologists. What I'm suggesting is that the disciplinary divide then, this is the binaries that I'm talking about, the disciplinary divides, the sociology versus anthropology, that comes out of Eurocentric Orientalism, defines the object of knowledge, but it also defines the subject. Who does the object of knowledge? And that becomes the ways in which you do research, you define what to study, how to study, why to study. This is a colonial inheritance, and this is a colonial legacy, which defines what is history and what is space, what is geography. So all of us in South Asia have to do anthropological theories, understand ourselves in terms of traditions, even though we are living in modern world. Because the rest of them are already modern, it's suggested. And therefore you have these modernization theories which came up even in the 50s and the 60s, or 40s to 60s, which came out from the United States, that you have modernization of traditions. And this is part of the binary, which has got constituted since the 18th and 19th century, which divided the disciplines into two, sociology and anthropology. Both study human beings. Both study, but one says we have to study the tradition, and the other says we have to study the modern. Both are, it is my contention, a conceptualization of Europe. Because through Orientalist perspective, Europe constituted what was the other, what was the East, what was the Orient. And some of the essays in this book talk about how the earliest thinkers in India borrowed from Orientalist thinking, and I mean J.S. Gurye, if anyone is from India, you would know him. J.S. Gurye, who is considered the father of sociology in India, who set up the Department of Sociology in Bombay University, whose, if you look at caste and race in India, that text suggests that we are a civilization, that is, India is a civilization. And by India, he really means South Asia, really. But he doesn't make that distinction. And that itself tells another story, which I won't go into right now. And India is a civilization. Where did he get that from? And he says it very clearly, that this civilization came from Greek and Rome. And that there is a genealogy of the civilizational transfer from Greece and Rome into India, and that's how we got incorporated within as civilization. And these theories get reproduced over time. That even today, a large number of sociologists in India think that India is a civilization. In 1956, D.D. Kosambi, the mathematician turned historian, wrote a text called Ancient Indian Civilization. And there he mentions so clearly, and it is to historians we need to go to try and see how this Eurocentric Orientalism actually constructs a world of India in the image of what the West wanted itself to see it as something which you need to go to past to be able to see what you are. D.D. Kosambi suggests that certainly there was a civilization which was Harappan and Mohenjo-daro, so it was not necessarily Indian. It was for the whole region. But that civilization died. And it remained as a mark in the minds of those who benefited from that civilization. And in the minds of those who wanted to reconstruct that, to create their own power. So he asks, what is the use of talking about zero today when all you have is the technology of the Buddha cart? And I think that is a very important question that sociologists and anthropologists today need to ask of themselves. Do we need the concept of civilization? Because what we see today in front of us is violence, whether it's ethnic or religious. Look at the number of people who have left various parts of this country to go back to the northeast because they have been threatened. You see violence or potentialities of violence. And this violence is not the violence only that the nation state has constructed. It's the violence of what is conceived as a nation, and its roots lie to the colonialism as a process, but also colonialism as a discourse. And as a result, I would suggest that if we have to think of salvation, we do not think of it in terms of the past. There is a very interesting short essay that Arthur Chatterjee has written in memory of a student of his who died. And it's very simple essay, and I would suggest you look at it. It's online, available online. It's called Our Modernities. And this, I think, is a discussion which doesn't locate itself only in India, but locates itself both to the imaginary South Asia and the real South Asia. And in this essay he asks that when the Enlightenment comes to Europe, Kant defines, Immanuel Kant understands Enlightenment as something by which the present can be changed in terms of the future. Enlightenment is about how you can bring the future to the present. But what happens to India and Indian intellectuals when they understand Enlightenment? They are caught into the colonial paradox of rejecting the West and at the same time accepting the West. And this paradox makes them go back to the Orientalist organization of knowledge, where they valorize the past to go to the future, rather than think of changing the present to go to the future and bringing the future into the present. This is the 19th century inheritance and legacy, which is both colonial and is both something which the elite of, I think, the whole South Asia, in terms of its political project as well as in its reality, imbibed and continues to structure and organize both the visions as well as the discourses of knowledge that are today in practice. And in order to go forward, it is important to displace this 19th century past and to really engage with India's and South Asia's modernity. And to do so, I think that we have to displace the divide of sociology and anthropology, and to connect oneself with the disciplines of political science and economics, which are modern disciplines today in each of these nation states. The market is discussed, the state is discussed. In the 19th century, Sumit Sarkar, the historian, has said that the intellectuals in Bengal, he's talking about Bengal, the intellectuals in Bengal only saw society outside politics, and therefore created for themselves a way to understand society which is insulated from politics, from economics, but also was simultaneously an elite-oriented, a patriarchal understanding of society. This needs to be displaced because today, 100 years after that 19th century imagination of that, those intellectuals, there's a necessity to see how politics is using or intervening with economy, culture, and sociabilities. In fact, sociabilities are constructed, and please recognize that I'm not using society. Again, which comes out of the Eurocentric conceptualizations. Bourdieu wants to use it as, Bourdieu tries to use social space, but I prefer to use sociabilities or socialities because these are always structured and reorganized all the time. And these sociabilities are economically, politically, culturally framed and reframed. And we need to, in doing that, we need to distance ourselves with a legacy that tries to see time as linear conception and organize in terms of certain spaces. If we liberate ourselves from that Eurocentricism, then these sociabilities can expand and at the same time look at it itself locally. Because South Asia is all across the world. It's not in the geographical space, which the British colonialists defined. I've tried to put together a lot of complex ideas in this lecture, and I know it may not have made clear sense, so I hope we will have a discussion. Thank you.
It did break down while Sujata was speaking. If you listen to a set of like this, it is fairly difficult to summarize it, and therefore I'm not going to do that. But as she said, we can try and fine-tune some of these things in the context of the conversation that we should emerge. And I hope that will happen. But personally, one of the things that I never really understood is about this boundary between sociology and social anthropology, which, for a person like me, from disparate background of English literature, political science, and sociology, it didn't make much sense when I decided somewhere along the line, okay, let me go to formal anthropology. And in fact, when I was interviewed to come to this university, one of the things that, I can't remember who, but one of the people who interviewed me, should we change the name of the department to sociology and anthropology? And I thought, why bother? You call it whatever you want, but basically, the border was not particularly useful. But then, at the time, I was teaching and researching in Tokyo, where this interview took place, and I was so surprised to see that the stark difference that people maintain between these two disciplines was so emphasized, and I was not used to that to the same extent in this region. And the Japanese seem to have a very clear idea of what anthropology was and what sociology was. I couldn't get it. Because the tsunami hit, and I was in Japan 2 weeks after. I was talking to some colleagues. Said, let's organize some. I needed to do two things. One, I was used to this idea of Shonada. I guess we people are used to that too. You donate your labor to. And I was also interested in this idea of research because we wanted to put in practice some kind of a research program to see what was going on. And they told me very clearly, this is not for politics, this is for sociology. So I still didn't get that. But it is, as you were saying quite rightly, this is a colonial legacy that we have not yet. But then, we established new universities like this, and we very dutifully replicate those kinds of binaries the way we organize faculties and in the 21st century. But then we are also, I guess, this is one of the things that we were trying to do when we were asking people within the faculty that we should have this idea of interdisciplinary approaches, so that you can maintain borders, but you can also displace at the same time when it's necessary. So, as I was saying, I hope that the connections between economics and history and political science with our kinds of disciplines like sociology and IR will become more apparent. And if we keep at it, but whether we can keep at it or not, I'm not sure. But anyway, I don't want to ramble on, so the floor is open. Anybody who wants clarifications from Professor Patel, please feel free.
Further thinking about this divide in terms of methodology. I have just come to finding interdisciplinary space. And I think put my reflections on this, and really what has become the difference between me and anybody else or sociologist was that I would not do numbers. And that's a different kind of conversation there about what kind of reality you're trying to grasp and how you get to it. I'm just wondering if you would reflect on this, also for us in this room. Starting out and
yes, sir. Connection. Yes, sir. Frequency matter. The frequency of the speakers is matter.
And in a sense, what kind of methods you use, whether now this is the divide between sociology and anthropology, and also in terms of what kind of reality one is trying to grasp, and what is the best way of doing it. And I was wondering if you reflect a little bit.
Unclear being a student of sociology, even now it's like somewhere to me it's quite unclear the fact that, as you said, that anthropology and sociology has been seen as opposition in terms of the study they engage in. Like sociology has been engaged in was said to be the study of modern, and anthropology is study of primitive. And it differed in the methodology as well. But today, as I see today, there has been a greater overlap in the way the way they engage in both the disciplines. There has been quite a number of similarities as well in terms of methodology, in terms of the areas they engage in. So, if we look at it now, if we look at the two disciplines now, how do we really see it?
My question is not related to the binaries of sociology vis-a-vis anthropology, but I have a very general concern with regard to the South Asian, if I may extend to South Asia, but the Indian mindset in general, two things. A, the vehement sort of discouraging of students taking up social sciences to begin with, as opposed to engineering or any other scientific, natural science subject. Secondly, I've seen even with my colleagues in the past 4 years of college, and I have seen the general mindset if we go out to research, if we want to study. The first idea is to go and look at something traditional, to study something primitive, or we are more concerned with that instead of, for example, as we even discussed in Sasanka's first class, nobody is really encouraged to study probably cyberspace, which is a very modern phenomenon. So I think we are generally driven to study something that is more primitive and traditional and rooted in our history. And for example, we're doing more about, we went for the research in Binaries and we were studying the traditional and all of that there. So probably as students, we also need to, we are obsessed with the South Asian idea of us being traditional, and we want to study more of that, I think. That's my personal opinion. So how do you think we can change that?
As you said before, Eurocentrism is even anti-universal kind of an idea, because it pertains it everywhere, but it does not allow other ideas to go. So my point is that when you are living in a colonial legacy, that everything is pursued and defined in a colonial fashion. Now it's a challenge how we will define our space in our version of it, with the language, color, and everything. What are the challenges before people of South Asia?
This is Sanjay. My question is, ma'am, when we talk about this Eurocentric approach of the West, then take for example of like if talk about this Hinduism. I read a book and it's written that this word itself is invented by this West because they can't understand that what is this. So they invented this. So how we can get out of all these things, and what is better? I mean, this sociology is like we study in the East, and anthropology what is there in the West. So what is the better option? Although we study anthropology as a subject inside the sociology, but I mean, what is best for us?
Thank you for the questions. Let me start with clarifying some conclusions. I started my discussion by suggesting that I studied cities. Cities are representative of modern age. And it's because I study cities I try to go back to try and find out why we don't have today a paradigm to understand cities in the way. And it is that led me to go into the past of how sociology understands cities. And I gave you a way in which we understand cities is as if it's at the point which we realize ourselves in. It's considered a civilization, it's a point, but if there is an investigation of what the city is, what it means, how it is organized, what are its inequalities, what are its exclusions, what are its politics, etc. And if you look today in the bibliographic references, we hardly have studies on cities. And that is a big question. What do we understand by cities? So, and therefore, that doesn't mean that what I said was the past, which was the division of sociology with politics, something that continues. In fact, the fact that he also works on cities, so the fact that we are working on cities suggests typology and that division of sociology versus anthropology, which was given as a legacy in the early 20th century and as the discipline developed till now. And then Srinivas defined sociology and social anthropology. So when the new nation states came up in what is called today South Asia, they suggested they were new states, they were modern states, so they defined, they suggested we set up departments of sociology. And the existing departments of anthropology converted themselves into sociology. So some departments remained sociology and social anthropology, others were sociology departments but did social anthropology and therefore anthropological work, and continued the traditions which were set up in 19th century in terms of their practices of doing theory, but also of doing methods and methodologies. And the methodologies that they used were those fashioned by anthropology and ethnography. However, there has been a revolution that has taken place in anthropology. And that revolution has come out from a reflection on what anthropology did in the rest of the world and why it is not being practiced in the West as a modern discipline. And today, much of the work on the cities is being done by ethnographers and anthropologists. And they do it within the department of anthropology, but they use participant observation. So, increasingly, there is very little distinction being made of the two disciplines. However, while the distinction between the two disciplines has got dissolved, the disciplines themselves have not opened itself too much to other disciplines. And that is the problem today. And that is why the title that can we make a social science rather than talking of ourselves as either sociologists or anthropologists only. And the reason why I'm going on harping on this point is because while we all go on changing our identities, whether as sociologists or anthropologists, the perspective does not seem to have changed. You talked about looking at traditions, and you asked the question of what are the new challenges. And I think one has to look at the causes to understand what are the new challenges and why traditions are repeated on and on and on again to be reflected on. And why is it that there is no plurality of methodologies in trying to understand what we have to understand? Why is it that we are not historians looking at archival material simultaneously while doing participant observation? And maybe participant observation may be understood more as a meta-theory for trying to understand what to focus on rather than using participant observation just to look at micro level social behaviors. There are many questions regarding the problems of doing theory, which needs to be reflected on and understood to really resolve the basic binaries of sociology and anthropology that have not constituted since 19th century and which needs to be resolved. I can admit that I am a historical sociologist. In my medical work, I go from 19th century to the 20th century and 21st century, and I encourage all my students to do that. And I think personally that what needs to be studied and understood is the fact that we are an urban, modern urban region, where urbanization and urbanism and ways to be urban has reconstituted so-called rural first. So that the divide of urban and rural, which has come down for a long time as a binary, should not be kept as a binary. But unfortunately, that continues to be reproduced within the way in which the curriculum is organized. And therefore, and the way in which we are taught that we have to use one or the other methodologies. I always try to suggest that today we need to understand contemporary social abilities. One needs to use a plurality of methodologies, and that there is a need, which is a point of view suggested by social theory. There is a need to go on reflecting on how to use which methods and methodologies to be able for each area of investigation, and why it is necessary to use a plurality of them, because without which it is very difficult to study what the phenomena we are studying in an interdisciplinary way. And I think contemporary social theories, whether it's Pierre Bourdieu, whether it's Patricia Hill Collins, who works on intersectional theory, whether it is even Ulrich Beck, who looks at risk, or we look at the theories of modernity itself, all of them indicate, and this is the most important thing, that the change that has come within sociology itself. Earlier I talked about the change that came within anthropology, but now sociology has changed itself from defining itself as sociological theory to defining itself as social theory, and they have admitted that sociabilities are constructed and reproduced within power structures. Therefore, social theory has to understand the power that organizes the inequalities and its reproduction in contemporary world. And therefore, given the close linkages between what the sociabilities are and what theories are, we have to understand the relationship between the two, and try to constantly reflect back on how the two intermesh with each other. And that kind of a project with social theory talks about, I think it's very necessary to understand how to dilute and displace the structures of received colonial thematics, perspectives, theories, methods, and methodologies. I'm not too sure, Leah, what you meant by saying that methodologies present the present divide. I think we have to look this institutionally, where you are located and who teaches you what teaches you. I studied in Bombay, where I had teachers who were Marxists, and therefore you were taught historical materialism as the only way to understand what is happening. My contemporaries studied in Delhi school, who was only taught ethnography as what defined the anthropology, the universe of society. So I think one has to locate oneself in where you are trained to understand how these divides have occurred. And I think we have to understand that these divides were dominant and non-dominant, ways of understanding the subject, the theories of the subject, and methods and methodologies of the subject. Various parts of in this country, only quantitative methods were taught. And in other parts, what was established as what the discipline was, only ethnography or qualitative was taught. So, I do know that outside the country, this divide is much more, the gatekeeping is much more, the boundary is very clear. And it is very difficult to do within the Department of Sociology an ethnographic work. No Berkeley does it. So I think those divides are also getting diluted right now. And this is the moment to seize the opportunity to take up challenges to redefine the thematics of what is sociology to, I would think, to social science, and define it in terms of what concerns our everyday life, which to me is studying violence, studying ethnicity and religious divide. Someone asked a question about religion, and again, let me tell you that historians have suggested that at least in context with India, and this comes out from the work done by Kosubi and then later by Romila Thapar, that historians have suggested and have given enough evidence to show that the knowledge about Hinduism was constituted in the 19th century, but that Hinduism as a living religion, as a diverse, plural ways of living religion, was there in the, without being named as Hinduism, was there for a long time. But after 19th century, it got organized as this being what it is. And Indian quote-unquote native intellectuals were part of that project, one of which, of course, was the great Swami Vivekananda, who understood religion in terms of the text rather than its lived aspect. So there is a huge, there is already work on this, and therefore we can understand the way the nationalist elite have used the politics of religion to continuously divide the groups that live in various parts of South Asia and outside South Asia. For instance, we don't have a study on migration. We generally don't have a course on migration of population from this region to across the world from 18th, 19th century, or even earlier, which is a work being done on the Indian Ocean region all over the world, but we don't integrate it in our courses. I've always wondered why not. And it's such a rich work because there is a long history of interaction between peoples from Africa to Southeast Asia, but it's never there in any of our courses. And after the British established its power, it has been much more. And that has created tensions of its own, including in Sri Lanka, but also in Myanmar. But we don't talk of Myanmar when we are talking of South Asia. And there are parallels, because there are both plantation economies. There are parallels between Burma and Sri Lanka, but we don't discuss that. And then on to Suriname and Fiji, etc., etc. So the world is a large world. And we have to move out of the geography and history that world has defined, and to reopen itself, to reopen our vision, to, even if we start with South Asia, to the way South Asia has framed the world.
Thank you for your presentation. Found very interesting. Also, a lot of these ideas which you seem to engage with. I mean, the questions keep coming up. It's just that we usually get stuck with it. So, thanks for a lot of these clarifications, some of these ideas. I have just some very minor questions. Some of them which have already been asked, but I was just also, when we talk about, when we try to situate, say, sociology and anthropology, and okay, let's just talk to these two disciplines within the context of South Asia, and situate them very much in the colonial heritage. And as you've also mentioned, within anthropology there has been an awareness since the 70s about its relationship to colonialism. I'm just also wondering though, what would it be like then for Indian sociology, for South Asian scholars in sociology and anthropology to start looking at the world beyond South Asia, not just in migration, but just like, we talk about the West and the East, but then what is the West? And I think that becomes a big question. Is it something simply monolithic? This whole discussion about Western civilization very often breaks down into French discussions on civilization versus the German discussions on culture which is very important in shaping how French sociology and anthropology emerges and German sociology and anthropology emerges, and then how the French sort of seem to, the British pick up from the French, and then German anthropology also ends up somehow in North America. For frankly, because simply one of them went and set up departments there. So what is it also, and especially also in the present now when we are hearing about the impact of recession and everything else, that's kind of questioning of what it means to be in the West right now. And so what I'm just wondering is, how do we then start looking at, say, these worlds from which we were defined by in the past, and we are still defined by in the present, but how those ideas are also shifting as well. I mean, one could also take guys like Zizek and so on. I haven't read about Zizek, and I don't understand Zizek, but the point is, and this is something that's pointed out by someone from, again, former Yugoslavia, scholar man, who said, I am not Western in the way you understand. I'm actually Eastern Europe, and our relationship with the West, which is Western Europe, is very different. So these sort of ideas could be used between regions constantly shifting. So that's one thing. So there's that, and again also the meaning of South Asia itself. I was educated in a department in England which prided itself on being old-fashioned. We're not like anything, like I think there's a comment of Professor made. I teach up to 1965, after that it's all rubbish. Which is basically, he didn't like Foucault or anything. But they have a course called the Anthropology of India. And which is a classic anthropology of India. Then later the course was picked up, two of my friends, young folks, picked it up and they decided to make it the Anthropology of South Asia. And they later said we're in a big fix because it's still, I mean, one go. It's really the Anthropology of India, we just throw in these other countries, we get a reference in it. Because one of them goes in Pakistan, there's a little more Pakistan at the expense of Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and so on. So the question is, what is South Asia in this case as well? And this becomes a very political question, how we see this in relation to contemporary geopolitics. And again, another understanding here, there's a presentation a few years back on forced migration in the Middle East, which I got to attend. And it was like a report, and the presentation, these are the listings of displaced peoples in various Middle Eastern countries, Palestinians, Egypt, and Iraq. And interestingly enough, Pakistan and Afghanistan get included in that. So the meaning of South Asia, again, this kind of, in the level of sort of practice in the Middle East, but it's constantly shifting. So how then do we as scholars look at these kind of political situations?
Thank you for your questions. Very challenging, and also I think they raise the problem that we have today. So I think we all are facing this problem all the time. I'll give you a formatted, an answer which is a reflective answer rather than a complete answer. Because there is no complete answer to both these questions. As we discuss it, new ways of thinking about it are emerging. And these are emerging simply because we are breaking away from the classification systems which we have inherited from the 19th century. And we don't know where it is going because at every point as we try to refashion them, new meanings are being posited in many new ways. For instance, today we have a very strong rightist religious movements in the diasporic community, which legitimizes the 19th century classifications, while today, here, we are trying to break away. So these are political questions because they get institutionalized in different ways. So in India, the diasporic community is actually trying to push again for professorship in Hindu religion, while we are trying to break away from that kind of nomenclatures. So having said that, let me say that both these questions are something which I wanted to address here, but I couldn't because I was just looking at my watch and I thought I'd gone beyond the 45 minutes I was given. I think any region is an imagination. And it is something which is politically structured. Capitalism, to spread itself out, it does it unevenly. And when it does it unevenly, it creates the other. So therefore the world system analysis will tell you there's a core and a periphery, and Wallerstein will say there's a core, semi-periphery and a periphery. This periphery and the semi-periphery are hinterlands, which capitalism creates. And at every point of time the region is reconstructed. What is the borderlines of each region? So there is the stability of capitalism which were possible earlier. We don't have that stability any longer. And particularly in the world that we are moving in, of internet connectivity, of sociabilities being constructed across virtual reality, the stability of these categories are itself being displaced. So we have to accept that the 19th century universes that were there are being displaced today, and therefore the challenges of how we go beyond what we have received, and in going beyond what we have received, we have to look at from where we have received, where we are receiving it, and how these are changing the localities that are structuring it. So it's good that you mentioned that you studied in England, because I think that makes, or especially I guess it must be Orient, I don't know, Suez or something like that, where there is this classical notions which continue, and in other places these are dissolved. But the question is, does the basic boundaries of East and West, which are conceptualized, they dissolve? And have they got dissolved in the world that we live in, where virtual reality has got organized differentially? And I think one has to look at it in terms of the politics of the moment. Who is defining what and why? Why are they creating divisions? Who is creating divisions and how are they creating divisions? And why are academic discourses involved in these divisions? And that is politics, because I've been insisting that we must look at knowledge as a political project. And from 18th century, knowledge has been a political project. And if we go much further, Foucault would suggest, as he did in the order of things, that the classification system comes in from 16th century. And that, the way in which representation and thought change, that kind of thing comes in 16th century. And why does it come in 16th century? Why does capitalism and actors of capitalism organize that knowledge system for its own benefit? Is something that we have to historically ask, and ask why it still continues. And I think unevenness, and this is unfortunately a theoretical position which Trotsky organized, but which has never got elaborated and institutionalized in an elaborate theory, is something that we need to understand and assess. So South Asia for me is a political project of first the colonialists, which thought of it as British India, and then of that British India converted into South Asia. The same thing is true for those who want to create these political projects, because it is part of that who want to continue capitalism in a particular way. And SARC ultimately is about integrating the markets. Now the point is, how much do we tune into that and how much do we integrate that? And for that, we need to look at, I don't know if you have circulated the map of South Asia that Iman has looked at. Okay. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. Yeah. And that is about India being the dominant in South Asia, and the politics of India being dominant in South Asia. There's a story to it. There's a political project here, which may be agreed to or may not be agreed to, but there is a way in which a region is really thought of by the politics of those who are outside, those who want to keep to one vision. And I think we need to dialogue with that as academics. And I think, but for me, South Asia is across the world, because those who have come from South Asia have been all over the world, and continue to have a place in the world, in its economy, in its politics, and in its culture. So if you want to start with region, then I think South Asia has to be thought of it across the world. And I'm saying it particularly because, as a strategy, in the way Modi uses the term strategy and negotiations, I think we not only have to go beyond the colonial discourse of what Anupal Kihar calls it the coloniality of power. We have to go beyond the coloniality of power, but we have to also go beyond methodological nationalism. Methodological nationalism wanted to create a knowledge for itself, for the peoples of the elite wanted to create the knowledge of the people it thought was its people. Let's put it this way. And that happened in India in a very strong manner in the 50s and the 60s through the discipline of economics, politics, and of course sociology and anthropology. And I think it happened wherever institutionalization of higher education took place, where funds came in the research and higher education of other countries also. But methodological nationalism has a negativity to it. It thinks that the nation, as defined by the state, is what it is, which is not true. That there are many nations, and that these nations are in formation. And in order to understand that, we have to destabilize the terms given received by methodological nationalism, and therefore to see it in the way in which nations are being formed, and their aspirations and expressions. And therefore, maybe as a strategy, it is important to redefine South Asia in this way, as a strategy, not as an absolute, as a strategy. Because that may be a possibility there may be a possibility to have a pathway that way. Maybe start by saying how South Asia is across the world, and therefore not restrict itself to the geography of and the history of the way it has got it. And thereby, once we open up, we'll see how, as this 19th and 20th century, if we want to start with colonialism, but I would think one should start before colonialism also. The mixing of cultures and ways of living, how there is no one conception of what is South Asia. Again, I would like to quote Kosambi, who was debating with Jawaharlal Nehru when he said, Nehru said unity, diversity. Kosambi went on saying, there is no unity and there is no diversity. There are many diversities and many unities, both culturally, economically, and we cannot accept this kind of a homogenization which comes from the idea of nation state. And in this case, it could be of South Asia. Then what do you do? And that makes me come to the last point. Because with it comes the other theoretical position. I don't know if you've seen the book by Revin Connell, which talks of southern theory. So if you don't talk of region, let's talk about, of a nation state, let's talk about the whole South together. But the South is against the east versus west. And Reverend Conan, the sociologist, has got this book out 2 years back called Sudden Theory. And I think that we are ourselves got into that problem again, where asking for geography to define the history. And I think we need to separate the two. And therefore, my last point is that social theory has to be accepted all social theory has to be universal. But at certain point of time, that universal got entangled with the politics of colonialism and the nation states which later developed. So it got associated with power. So it got associated with imperialism. That's how Eurocentrism and Orientalism got organized. But we have to therefore accept that all theories have to be decentered from its use as a power. And as soon as you see that it's getting used as a power, we realize the limits of that theory. And therefore, all the time, theories have to structure itself in the way Bourdieu talks of reflexivity, and to structure itself out of the problematic of power. And to look itself, argument itself against itself from the margins. Then only we can move forward. And by which I mean there will be constant instability of formulations of the
right out of what you just, the last point that you made. And I was just wondering what you felt about how both disciplines, sociology and anthropology, are called to serve instrumental purposes, of prescribing, of proscribing, in relation to negotiations for space, since we also study the cities, urban or otherwise. We've read a bit about how disciplines like history and archaeology, the discussions within the disciplines offers discomfort in being called to question or in being called to answer contestations for definitions of space. So, what do you feel about sociology and anthropology now being called to perform these functions? I study the Tibetan diaspora in India, and so by sociologists, the rhetoric within the diaspora of so that sociologists may say we are feudal or we are barbaric, we would still go back to colonial anthropology and we would say that they define us as civilized, as distinct from China. So how the selective evocation from the two disciplines now for an instrumental purpose? So you talked about how we need to distance from power. So what do you feel about this sort of instrumental use of both the disciplines? And should they be called to perform this function, and how? Or if not, then why not?
We'll take your question before.
Listening to you respond to this last question, the way in which South Asia is organized, you have been saying some kind of colonial legacy. And respond to that, as a social scientist, how do you see what are the alternatives if you like, or whether there is any equitable South Asia organized also?
One for the establishment, broadly, there are differences within it also. One for the establishment, one for against it. My position has been, if you want, it's completely clear that both sociology and anthropology had become handmaidens of colonialism and of modernity. And it continues to be. If you want it, absolutely should have. However, I am in the Department of Sociology. I work in that discipline. I contribute to the production of knowledge in that discipline. And I recognize that there are many trends within the discipline which contest with many of these positions. So there is a dominant position, and I was explicating the dominant position. But there are subversive positions to this, and these are many. And there are many ways in which one can extract these subversive positions for refashioning the discipline. So the first thing I was trying to do was to say that for me, there is nothing as sociology, but more importantly, it is social science. Two, in my own practice, I'm an historical sociologist. I do quantitative work to understand aggregate trends, but I know that if I have to find more germane answers, I can never use quantitative data. But I can use aggregative data to understand class divisions in terms of consumption lifestyles if I want to start my meta theory by making my distinctions. So, therefore, I suggested that it's very important to use and to know the limits of each method and methodology. But I also take the position that methodology defines the theory. And that has been acknowledged by a lot of social theorists, because methodology tells you what to study and how to study. If you get out of that methodology, you may be able to do it differently. So, therefore, certain dominant trends within the discipline are instrumental. And, for instance, when Srinivas wrote Rampura, he went and studied the village, which was divided in terms of castes. And he stayed with the Brahmin community. And then he justified it in Rampura. And therefore, we never got what happened to the rest of the... It was the image that came out which represented one group's conception of the village. And in the contributions to Indian sociology, there was a debate on this. And only one person, F.Q. Bailey also said it, but one person said it most openly, and that was Parvati Amma, a woman who was a Dalit and a scholar from Mysore University, laid out his Brahminical approach. And it took Professor Kuman so many years then to write and make a presentation of the same position in 2 years back in the Hyderabad Congress of Indian Sociological Society, and it got republished in Sociological Bulletin 2 years back. So, despite this being told so many years back, it continued. No one showed that of Srinivas's work. And it took all these years for mainstream sociologists to come up and say it, which means that knowledge is instrumental. It's today that the Dalit question has become so important that it becomes legitimated to be able to state it. There is therefore a very close relationship between these ideologies and we have to reflect on it, because we are. So, social theory is normative. It is accepted, we have to work with it, and therefore social theorists have reflected on how to use protocols of research to try and relate that ideological position, which you call instrumental, that ideological position from the scientific, and where and how one can do it. And Bourdieu constantly states that subjectivity and objectivity, you have to move out of it to be able to understand what is the social security practice. And this is not only Rotary's position, I would suggest you look at Hill Collins, Patricia Hill Collins, or you look at any other thing. They all suggest that we are in a social science which is normative. We have to understand and draw from a new conception of science. We have to draw from making complexity studies to be able to reframe social theory. And to do so, we have to accept the limitations and problematics that our own investigations and reflections structure. So, beyond this, I can't explain. I think I tried to say what was South Asian, what could be. First of all, I want to again restate, I don't think there is a South Asian. Except how those in positions who want to state what it is suggest it is. But then what does a university like this do? Because it is a university. It is not a political project of some only. So then it has to initiate a reflection to rethink space. And I think it can be different. And that is what some of the ways I have suggested. Having understanding in terms of migration, also having a reflection on the inheritance of the history of ideas on the disciplines, the need to have history. I think history is very important. And to rethink capitalism in different ways, which creates interests and to express consciousness. And how to understand four different spaces and how things intersect all the time. What is local as defined by the knowledge as local, region as defined by knowledge as region, national as defined by knowledge as national, and global. These four intersect all the time, and we ignore all four, and we always do the study of one or the other. Regional studies to region, and micro studies to local, and sociology does not.
Well, I'm going to lie. I mean, I would really thank you very much, but I think it's a good time to conclude in the sense that we can conclude on the thought that South Asia still needs to be imagined. In the sense that, as you were saying, like all regions, it is an imaginary. At the same time, the problem is regimes take it very seriously. That is why that Farid and I need these nasty visa regimes to go through to kind of come and teach in Delhi. Even though I believe that an institution like SAU ideally should have the imagination to reimagine South Asia. That is why we used that Himal map last year to make that point in an internal presentation, but I wasn't here, but my colleagues were told, this is being anti-India, which had nothing to do with it. So, for an undefined or imagined region, there are these borders that are so contested and concretized. And I would be very happy to see these things be dismantled in some fashion in times to come. But anyway, I have to also think of a speaker who has come all the way from Hyderabad and stayed from the airport to here without lunch. So I think there is some food and drinks outside, so let's go and enjoy that. And as well as continue the conversation more. Thank you very much.